Well, it's time for us to finish our very last lesson in the book of Acts. I am so excited. This is a very good lesson. If you can tell by your notes that you have, it is a long lesson. However, it is long because if we don't cover everything, I want you to have it. And so we're going to skip through this thing pretty quick and get through pretty fast. I've actually been able to do it in the last two classes. In the last class, the middle class I do is only 35 minutes long, and we were able to finish. So you say, why can't we finish in this class? Because I skipped some stuff in that one and to be able to finish it. So let's get started. Julius has been given Paul under his custody. He is a centurion. He is the leader of a centurion group. Centurion meaning 100. He's got 100 men with him who are they are with the Augustan cohort, and their job is to take messages out into the Roman Empire from Caesar and to bring back prisoners who have the death penalty upon them or who are coming back to appeal to Caesar. And when bringing them back, they will then be used in the, if they've got the death penalty upon them, they will be used in the games there in Rome and throughout Italy for spectators to enjoy the humans being torn apart by animals and by all the type of stuff. We do the same thing today. We just don't allow them to kill them on purpose at the football games and all that type of stuff. When we pour 40,000 folks into an arena, and then you sit back and watch it on the television, we're so excited. And same type of games almost, except for the purpose is not death in those cases. We do the same thing. Nothing's really changed in much of that. So in Rome, that's the reason why they get there. Well, Julius has been in charge of getting Paul back to Rome with other prisoners. And in fact, when he's found a boat, and that boat is owned by the city of Adramytton, and that boat is owned by that city. In fact, it was a common practice in the days of Paul and even before for cities who would own boats, and they would put them out on the water to take the goods that they had to sell. For instance, this is a ship that is an Egyptian ship, as well as one from Alexandria, which in fact we're going to learn about two from Alexandria. They're Egyptian ships, and Egypt grows grain, and they put the grain on these ships, and off these ships go to sell from port to port to port. For whatever reason, this ship has come up from Egypt, which it's full of grain, and it is in Caesarea at this point in time. And Julius boards the ship with Paul and with whoever would go along, with the soldiers and with the prisoners. And we find out that Luke and Aristarchus go along too. Now, Luke and Aristarchus are fellow laborers with Paul in the ministry, but they are not under arrest. They join the ship. They have to pay their own passage to go. Paul's passage is being paid by Rome. But Luke and Aristarchus, their passage, they would have to pay their own. By the way, once with Julius, the centurion, coming on board with his soldiers and the prisoners, that was just extra money for a ship to make on the sailing voyage. Think about that. You're loaded with grain. You're going to try to get that grain someplace before it gets wet and swells up and it's no good. You try to get it to a port. And if you can pick up people along the way to carry at a fair, that's just extra money that you don't plan or plan on to make the trip. And sometimes, we start doing the things that are just extra, and before long we make those things mandatory for us to be able to make the trip. You know how that is. It becomes the common practice. So there in Caesarea, they hop on this ship and they sail up to Sidon. Follow me here. And embarking on an Adriatic ship, which was about to sail to the region along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, and on the next day we put in at Sidon. And Julius treated Paul with consideration, allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. And from there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. And when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Cilicia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myra in Lycia. Can you imagine? They take off from Caesarea, they go to Sidon, and while they're there unloading grain, loading cargo, finding other people to join on the ship so they can continue on the voyage and make money, they allow Paul and Luke and Aristarchus, Paul specifically, go in and visit your friends. Julius allows him, hey, go have fun, have the day off. Okay, you're out of prison today, go on. This is in the same area as Caesarea. Go on and have fun. Oh, by the way, the ship is leaving at such a time. Be back by then. And Julius allows him to go. You can tell he's under arrest, but Paul doesn't have a charge on him. There's not a charge. Julius is sitting there, why have I got this prisoner that does not have a charge? Now, Julius knows the circumstances, but still he understands he's got to take Paul to Rome. He's under his care. But he allows Paul to go, and Paul goes. They could have gone on. They could have never come back. No, Paul's on his trip to Rome. So he shows back up with Luke and Aristarchus, and away they go. And this text tells us, as we've just read, they come over and the winds are blowing contrary. So they come out to Cyprus, and they trail along Cyprus, and they come in and they land in Myra. Now, the ship that they are on is going to go on up into this little bay area to some other ports. And so, while they are there, Julius finds another ship. Now, this ship is going to be from Alexandria, down in Egypt. Alexandria is down about right in here, somewhere in this area. And so they pick up this Alexandrian ship, verse 6. And there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us on board. And when we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the winds did not permit us to go further, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salome, and with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a certain place called Fair Havens, near which also the city of Lasea. Now, Lasea is an important city in those days. We know that because we've actually got a minister there that Paul has dropped there in the past. But he's only given that to us as a point of reference. Fair Havens is 5 miles from Lasea. So here's what happens. They hop in this Alexandrian ship, and they are having a difficult time. It is taking them a long time just to get to this little island off here called Cnidus. Now, the intent would be to go over here to Corinth, have the boat taken across, and come to Italy this way. That would be the intent. That is the cheapest way to go. Even having that boat picked up and pulled over that 4 to 6 mile stretch by hand, where they'd actually roll this boat that's got all these people, grain, everything, up on logs, and they'd roll the logs and take a log and put it behind and keep rolling, or take the logs from behind and keep them putting in front. They'd roll these ships across the logs and put them back in the water. That was cheaper and less dangerous than trying to go around and all that. That would be the intent, but that's not what happened. They barely get to Cnidus. So in Cnidus, the captain makes the decision. We'll just sail south. We'll just go around Crete. That's what we will do. So they intend to sail south. The winds come in. They blow south, and they come around, and they land at Fair Havens right here. Lysias is 5 miles from Fair Havens. Now, the whole island of Crete is only 140 miles long. And so they land at Fair Havens. Now, Fair Havens is not a good port to be in the wintertime. Well, let's just pick up and we'll see it. I'll cover that as we get there. Verse 9. And when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since the fast was already over. Time out. The fast is already over. When you see the wording that the fast is over, it always refers to the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement in Jewish thinking is the day that the Lord slaughtered the animals to make the animal skins to cover Adam and Eve. He did that on the Day of Atonement. It is also the day that happens to be the exact same day that Abraham offered up Isaac on the altar there, on the stone there in Mount Moriah, and then the Lord saves Isaac from the death. You know that story. During the time of the wilderness, they set up the Day of Atonement, which always is around December the 6th to December the 12th or somewhere there. In history, the day, in our history, when they go back and they date the days of what was the day when the Lord killed the animal to cover Adam and Eve with skins, it was December the 10th. October the 10th. October the 10th. What was the day that Abraham offered up Isaac? It was October the 10th. All right. So when the day lands on October the 10th, by the moons and all that type of stuff. That's the really special day. But they still worship it when it falls on other days. And in this year, it happens on October the 6th. It is past. You do not want to be on the eastern part of the Mediterranean during wintertime because of the violent storms that come through and the wave actions and everything that happens. You don't want to be out there. So Paul is with them. He says, hey, look, the fast is already over. That means wintertime is coming. So that's where we pick up. Fast is already over. Paul began to admonish them and said to them, men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be attended with damage and great loss, not only of the cargo and the ship, but also our lives. In other words, what he's saying is from my experience. In fact, the word means spectator. I have seen this happen before. He has been on 3 long voyages before, and he is saying, from my experience, we don't want to be out here. Let's stay where we are here in Fair Havens. Let's go anyplace else. Let's stay here for the winter. That's what he says. It's just of his opinion. It's not from God. It's not from the Lord. It's just his opinion. Verse 11, but the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what Paul was saying. You know, for Paul to be even in the place to talk to the captain and talk to the pilot is incredible. He is under guard to be taken to Rome, but he's not chained down like the rest of the prisoners. He's free to roam about and to talk to whoever. And he's out there on this ship. He's watching what happens. He's where he can talk to them. Well, they don't listen to him at all. Verse 12. And because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached the decision to put out to sea from there if somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. And here's the reason why. The harbor at Fair Havens actually had a big mouth to it. Had a huge mouth, and it faced south and west. And the problem is as the wave actions came in, it would drive the boats all into land, into the harbor. You know, you tie your boat up next to on one side, and the wave action comes that way, it's going to beat into the pier. You know what I'm talking about on that. And if you can't tie them, these boats are sitting out there in the water, and even though they have anchors, as the water comes in and rises with the wave actions, it will push those boats on up, and it will cause them to be dry, to be up on the sandbars and on the bay and on the beaches where they can't get them out. It's not safe. In fact, it'll tear up the ships. If they come around to Phoenix, now Phoenix is just 40 miles by water around. If they come around to Phoenix, that harbor is facing the other direction, and it has a small mouth to it. They'll have to come around and then sail into it. And this area, no matter how the waves come, from this direction or from this direction, this area is going to be fairly calm, even in the most winds. And I know that, for example, we can go down to Clear Lake. You know, Clear Lake, it's at the most 5 foot deep. Now, I think there's 5 foot of silt underneath the 5 foot of water. We make a joke, Charlie and I make a joke, when we take out people, they go, oh, do we have life jackets? And we say, yeah, we got life jackets. And by the way, if this boat sinks here in Clear Lake, where you're sitting won't be underwater yet. So don't worry about it, you know, because we tootle down in Clear Lake with about 1 foot, 18 inches of water underneath the boat. That's all we've got. But Clear Lake can get rough. And I wish we had some pictures to show you. When the water came up, Charlie's Pier, Betty's Pier that goes out into Clear Lake, it literally was torn up by the waves. And yet, the boat sitting back into the little harbor area that's protected where the winds can't hit the water and the water can't pick up, you know, the boat just sits there and goes, bloop, 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 bloop. Back when ICE happened, there's some webcams, and I was up in the Waxahachie area. I was able to dial in webcams around, it's interesting what you can do on the website, webcams around Clear Lake. And sure enough, we saw them. They're pointed out towards Clear Lake, and the waves or actions are tossing and turning. And we saw a boat out there that ended up over in between 2 houses after it's all said and done. We saw that boat just being tossed and turned out on little bitty Clear Lake. And it was a ship. Yeah, it was a ship. It was 60 feet long. It was, yeah. At The guy was trying to ride it out. That was interesting. Yeah, he rode it out until the winds turned around the other direction, and he forgot to turn the boat around during the eye of the storm passing, and then he couldn't get the boat turned around because it was pushing him from the back, and it ended up between two houses up on land, way up on land, by the way. And I saw my little boat over there, and it's just tooting along, just, not doing anything. The wind's blowing 100 miles an hour, it's just doing this. So that's what's happening in the harbor. This is a safe area. So all they've got to do is just get to Phoenix, just 40 miles away. That's like leaving, let's say you're hopping on a boat at the flagship in Galveston, and you just want to go down to Freeport, all right? That's what we're talking about. Just right around there, just down there. It's kind of like if you're going from League City you just got to be able to sail down to Hobby Airport, all right? That's just how far we're talking about. Not very far, all right? All right, well, here we go. So the harbor was not suitable for winter, so they put in, it's going to go down to Phoenix. Verse 13. And when a moderate south wind came up, it's blowing from this direction. Just a moderate south wind comes up. Look what happens. Supposing that they had gained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began to sail along Crete, close inshore. But before long there rushed down from the land a mighty violent wind called the Euryquela. And when the ship was caught in it and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and let ourselves be drifted along. Here they go. They're just going along just a little ways around here, and they don't get very far before this wind comes. And this wind that comes down comes off of the Adriatic Gulf and Sea, and it's blowing this way. It's a violent storm. In fact, the storm is so strong that it's almost like a typhoon or a hurricane, is what the word means here that it's calling it. So it blows it along, and they can't face it. They can't go. They don't have a motor. They don't have oars to row with. This is a sailing ship. And all they can do is just bring down the sails and let the winds push it along. So it begins to push. And as it begins to push, they come down. There's a little island down here by the name of Claudia, about 7 miles long, 3 miles wide. They try to hide behind the island, but that's no good. The winds are just blowing over. It keeps blowing and blowing. The storm passes by them, and they begin to make this turn like here. Oh, I haven't read that part of the scripture yet, so let's pick up with that. Verse 16. And running under the shelter of a small island called Clauda, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. And after they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables to undergird the ship. And fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis, they let down the sea anchor and so let themselves be driven along. They're afraid of this area down here called Syrtis. Now it's out in the water. It's underneath the water. It is a reef area that also is a sandy area, and it's got a reef there, and they're afraid they're going to be driven on. So what they do before they get to it, they perceive that they're there. They throw out the anchors out the back and just let the winds blow them along with the anchor slowing them down, because they're afraid they're going to get on this shallow area out here and get the boat stuck, and they will not be able to get it out. Now let me just put this in perspective for you of how far this is. Let's say that you're just trying to go from Galveston to Freeport, but now you find yourself 40 miles off of Cancun. You follow this map is not to perspective, all right? That's what we're talking about. That's what we're talking about. They've been carried almost to Cancun, and now the winds have blown and are blowing them back the other direction. All right. The next day, as we were being violently storm-tossed, they began to jettison the cargo. Now, they're not getting rid of the grain yet. It's a grain ship, but they're getting rid of the cargo. And on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. The tackle, man, you don't want to deal with that. Well, they're getting rid of everything they can get rid of except for the money stuff on the ship. And since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us, that means it was a huge storm, in other words, from then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. I mean, they are fearful for their lives. And the storm has passed by them. Now, want you to follow something here with me. You know how it is when the eye of the storm turns. The winds change directions. I never will forget when I came along, the winds were already blowing when we left our house with our 7 little plastic containers of everything that was near and dear to us. Now, I don't know. In fact, those things are still packed. If we get anything new and near and dear, it goes into one of those containers. We are ready to go. We load those 7 containers. They've got everything that we need to continue life in them with our photos, albums, and pictures that we have to have. Everything is there. And by the way, there's not hardly an original anyplace out in the house. If you want the original, it's in the container. If you want to see the fake copy, it's on the wall. You got that? Okay. That's just the way we've got it, so that we're not going to lose these things that are valuable to us. We put those in. We get the dog. We get the 2 bunnies. Anybody want some bunnies for lunch? Anyway, we got to put the 2 bunnies in. And off we go. As we're driving out of the driveway, the winds are already blowing, and the tree in our front yard is already blowing and leaning towards it's our main big dining room. The dining room is a huge dining room. It's got 24-foot ceilings in it. And if that tree hits right where it was going to go down, I promise you it would go through that roof and go on down on top of our huge dining table and all that. Kay said, what's going to happen to that tree? It's leaning. Should we take it down? I said, Kay, the wind's blowing too high. If I got a chainsaw today and hooked onto it with a rope on both of our cars together, the wind is blowing so hard, I am not sure whether we could take it down and keep it from hitting the house already. Let's just pray that the tree comes down when the storm passes on the other side. She said, well, where would it be landing there? I said, it will be landing in the middle of the street. When the storm passes by, and if those winds will take it down, coming back, whipping around, it'll be landing in the street. We show back up 2 weeks later, and you know what that tree was? Right in the street, right where I told Kay it was going to be. Lord looked out for us. But that's exactly what happens here. The wind coming down this way is blowing them, and as the eye passes over them, it then begins to blow them back up. In fact, it blows them back up into what is called the Adriatic Sea. This is this area south of the Adriatic Gulf. But on maps that you look out today, if you look this up on a map today, on current maps, this is called the Adriatic Sea. But in Paul's day, it was the Adriatic Gulf. And it emptied into the Adriatic Sea, right into this area. That's the same thing with Malta. I have an 1898 King James Version of the Bible. In that version of the Bible, this island is not called Malta, it's called Melita. But they changed it in the 50s because the island changed its name, so you would know where it was. They changed it in the King James Version, and it's been changed in our version, so we know it's Malta, which is still called today. But that's what Bible people do, the committees do, so that we know where it happened. As the name changes, they change it so we know where it is. So they're up into the Adriatic Sea. So let's pick up there and let's go on down. Verse 21, and when they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in the midst of them and said, you just hate people like this to be around. You just hate them. Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. Okay, shorten to that what we say. Y'all, I told you so. I told you so. All right, that's right. Verse 22, and yet now I urge you to keep up your courage, for there shall be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. It's not going to be a loss of life. Well, how does he know? Well, back over here we left Crete. He said, look, if you leave, I think what's going to happen is we're going to lose the ship, we're going to lose lives, we're going to lose everything. But now he's up here and he goes, we're not going to lose any lives, but we are going to lose this ship. Well, how does he know? A little angel told him, verse 23. For this very night an angel of the God to whom I belong. Now they don't belong to this same God. They worship a different God. But Paul says the God that I belong to and whom I serve stood before me saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. In other words, not a single person is going to lose their life. So Paul's encouraged. So he's got up, he says, hey boys, stop worrying. Listen, you should have listened to me. I told you so. But since we're here, don't worry. All of us are going to live. We're going to be okay. But we're going to lose the ship. But we're going to be okay. Verse 25. Therefore, Keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island. Now, I want to know how come that angel didn't tell them what island, so they could have headed towards it. They didn't even know where they were, folks. They had no idea where they were. A certain island was going to come up, and it's going to be the right island, it's going to be the proper island, and when they get there, it was going to be the right place to be. Verse 27. And when the 14th night had come, as we were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, that's this part of the area right in here, about midnight, the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. Surmise. How do you surmise? You see birds, you see things floating that shouldn't be there, that would come from land. You see grass coming up or whatever. And so what do? And they took soundings. That's where they take a rope that's got knots in it, and every knot is so long, and they throw it out into the water, and they bring it back up, and they measure how many knots follow after. They take these soundings to find out how many fathoms they are, how far down, how many fathoms are down. And they found that there would be 20 fathoms. And a little further, they took a sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. And fearing that they might run aground themselves on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. They've had these anchors on the back of this boat dragging them along anyway. You see that? They're afraid that they're holding them down. They're afraid they're heavy, so they're going to get rid of these 4 anchors. Now, these are not all the anchors they have. They have some more anchors on board. Folks, when you're dealing with a ship that's carrying this much weight and this big, you better make sure you got some backups to your backups. Plan B, C, D, E, F, G, and H, and I, J. So they've got these things, and they throw 4 of them off, and they just wish and pray for daybreak. Now, all of y'all know what I'm talking about, because some of y'all have been up all night wishing that your sun would surely come up so that you go ahead and get up. Now, some of you go ahead and get up and you tell us all about it. You just don't tell us that you go to bed at 7. I've been up since 4:30. Sun's not even up, and I get up and get all my chores done 4:30. Yeah, well, you missed the good TV after 7. That's what you did also, yeah. You missed the 10 o'clock news to find out what happened in your area. Verse 31, Paul said to the centurion, they begin, and they let, verse 30. And as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship, they let down the ship's boat into the sea on the pretense of intending to lay out anchors from the bow. So they're letting go of these anchors on the back. Now they're going to let the safety boat down, and the sailors are all trying to get into it, acting like they're going to put anchors out the front. Got that? To anchor the... Paul goes, no. You get off of this boat, and you get in that little safety boat, you're not going to survive. You better get back on this boat. Well, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers. Remember, the centurion is not by himself. He's got 100 soldiers with him guarding these prisoners that they're taking back. Unless these men remain in the ship, you yourselves cannot be saved. Then the soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it fall away. They got back on board and they let it go. They're going to have to line that weight some other way, some other how. And so that's what they did. They've been on that boat for 14 days. They've been storm-tossed. Now, if you haven't ever been storm-tossed in a boat, you hadn't lived yet, and hope you never have to live through that. Because let me tell you, when you get out, David Painter, who is a member of our church, he was working on getting his captain's license in a boat, and it just so happens my boat's big enough that he can get his license for a boat about 3 times the size of my boat. So we went out on this day. He has to have 4 hours in it, has to do certain things. And so we went out on the boat, and there were 6-foot waves in the Galveston Bay on that day. Let me tell you something. First of all, I wish we had not left the dock. Second of all, I lost my lunch first, and he lost his lunch second. And the boat, even though it has 2 engines on it, it didn't do too well. I mean, it did okay, and the boat survived, but, okay, and it's tough. And then coming back in with these waves coming back against you, you think you're steering this way, you take your eyes off it, you're going over here. It's just, all right, you just constantly this and this and this and this. you're not interested in eating eggs and bacon and ham. You're not interested in anything. For 14 days, these men have gone without food, and they are hungry. So verse 33, let's pick up there. Is that where we are? Yes, it is. And until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take some food, saying, "Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation. For not a hair of the head of any of you shall perish." And having this said, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke it and began to eat. And all of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. The man of God takes the bread in the midst of the storm, and he blesses it. He begins to eat and begins to pass it out. Now, folks, this is not just a little bread, because let's look what happens. And all of us in the ship were 276 persons. 276 people. They've all gone without food for 14 days. The ship has been tossed. This has been a journey, unbelievable. And there they are. And when they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. The land's coming up underneath the water, so it's time to get rid of the wheat. What they want to do is get as close to land as possible so they don't have to swim so far. So they start hauling the grain out of this ship. Boom, 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 boom. And when day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a certain bay with a beach. And they resolved to drive the ship on into it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they left them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresails to the winds, and they were heading for the beach. We're home free, they're thinking, if we can just get into that beach. They don't even know where it is. They don't care where it is. They don't care how they're going to be treated when they get there. Let's just get to land. And I'm telling you, if you'd been on the water in a storm for 14 days, you wouldn't care who was there either. You would just get there. We'll deal with who's there when we get there. Y'all have all had that attitude about something in your life. Verse 41, but striking a reef where two seas met, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. But the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. And the soldiers planned to kill the prisoners, that none of them should swim away and escape. And that was a typical move to do when a ship was being broken up, was to kill the prisoners. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intentions and commanded that those who could swim should just jump overboard first and get to land. All right, everybody, they started loosening the chains, they unlocked them and everything. You just get to land. Everybody, sailors out, prisoners out, go to land. It's the only place they saw. They could only go one direction. If they wanted to swim back toward the water, that was their fault. And Julius just says, get there. Get there however you can. And the rest should follow. Some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And thus it happened that they were all brought safely to land. So there they went. They went into this bay on Malta or Melita. And there, as they got there, it is a wonderful place for them to stay. But they have not gotten there under wonderful conditions. And let's see what we're talking about here. Verse 1, it says, and when they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta. And the natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in, and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all. Folks, let me tell you something. Most of the people who go out with me on our boat in the summertime, they bring sweaters. Do you know why? Because it gets cold on the water even in the summertime. You can go out to watch the fireworks in June and have a chill at night. And they've been in the water in wintertime. They've been in the water for 14 days. They are almost at the end of October. They're well into the 20s of October at this point in time. It's cold. And they're a little bit higher up than we are here in Houston on the line that goes around the world. They're a little higher up. They're more like between Centerville and Ennis, Corsicana, almost to the Dallas area. If you know anything about that, when October comes around, first football game in October, it's going to be cold. It's not going to be warm up in those areas. Now, we may still be warm down here, but it's going to be cold up there. That's what they've been living through on the sea. It's been a harsh time on this sea. Plus, it's seawater. It's salt water. Folks, if you've not ever been around salt water, first of all, makes you dehydrated. You get thirsty, but if you drink the salt water, it dehydrates you more. And it's better to go without the salt water than it is to drink it, because as soon as you drink it, it dehydrates you more. It's kind of preserving you up for somebody to eat later on, like salt pork and all that. Some of us look like we would probably be salt pork or whatever that, thinking about that. Well, the natives were extremely wonderful to them. Now, who are the natives? Well, over here, the first folks to inhabit the island of Malta were from the Phoenicians from this area. And they inhabited early on. And then along came the Greeks. And the Greeks overtook the island, and so they didn't run the Phoenicians off, they just left Greek people there. Well, the next thing is, down from the North African area, the Carthaginians came, and they overtook the Greeks of the island. And then finally, about 200 to 300 years before, the Romans came in, and they took over the islands. So you've got Phoenicians, you've got Greeks, you've got Africans, you've got Romans. You got that? They're all taking over the islands. So this is a mixed breed of folks. And they are also superstitious folks, because remember, this is still ancient times. And they are looking for the gods to come down from heaven to bless them. And so they think they're always superstitious. Everything, something happens, that's for a reason. The gods are doing that because you're an evil person. You shouldn't have done that. Or, the gods are looking upon us. Well, here's what happens. Here we go, on verse 3. But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened onto his hand. You got it? And when the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, here's what they begin to say. They're so superstitious. Undoubtedly this man is a murderer, and though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not let him live. That's the superstition in them. The way they think. And so, however, he shook off the creature into the fire and got burned up, and he didn't suffer anything from it, no harm. And when they were expecting to see that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead, but after they had waited a long time and they'd seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their mind and began to say that he was a god. There's nothing new. Paul's already gone through this once before. When he was over here in Lystra, right here in Lystra, they thought he was the god Mercury, if you remember. And when they found out he wasn't, they stoned him. He was stoned twice, if you remember, so they just stoned him. Well, Paul's kind of learned how to handle himself, so on Malta, he doesn't allow them, he doesn't balk at it so fast, and he's not a god, and he's not going to pretend to be a god, but he doesn't handle it the same way. Verse 7. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man on the island. Leading man. King James says the chief man. Either of those words would translate for us the governor of the island. His name is Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously for 3 days. So it's Paul and Luke and Aristarchus and maybe Julius. We don't know who else. But when Luke says us, he's talking about the three of them. And it may have been the whole 276 people, okay? 276 people, the soldiers, the sailors, the prisoners on this boat. And 100 of these folks are soldiers. We don't know who all it was, but Luke, Paul, and Aristarchus are at least taken care of by Publius. And here's what happens. And it came about that the father of Publius was lying in bed afflicted with recurrent fever and dysentery. Well, if you don't know what dysentery is, I'll let you go look it up. All right. Or look down. I don't know. Either way. All right. And Paul went in to see him after he had prayed, and he laid hands on him, and he healed him. Publius' father is healed from dysentery and the fever, and you know what that's going to start? Publius' dad is going to be healed by Paul. Are you sick? Let's go see Paul. Let's don't go to the medicine man on the island. Let's go see Paul. And after this happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured. I'm telling you, Paul knew how to handle himself this time. And so in verse 10 it says, "And they also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all that we needed. And at the end of 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship." They'd been on an Alexandrian ship that had gotten broken up. Now there's an Alexandrian ship that had wintered there on the island, there in Malta, in that harbor, on that beach, and which had the twin brothers as its figurehead. Now out on front of the ships, they used to carve these figureheads out on the front of mermaids and everything. Well, this ship had the twin brothers out there. Now that is always, through Greek literature, the two sons of Zeus. It is Castor and Pollux, and they're out there as twin heads. They are not only the deities of that ship, they also are the name of that ship. The twin brothers is the name of the ship, and they're the deities of the sailors. If they're going to pray to someone, they're going to pray to those two deities on the front prow of their ship. Not going to do them any good, but they didn't know any difference. They'd still pray to them. And so, whenever they get on this ship and they are heading out, and they're going to head on up as they sail. They leave Malta. Okay, let's wait. Let's finish our trail here of the ship. They end up in Malta, and now they're going to go around to Syracuse. Syracuse is the capital city of Sicily. So let's pick up there. And after we had put in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. We don't know why they stayed there for 3 days, but they stayed there for 3 days. Could the winds not have been right? Because they're facing this. They're at the end of winter time. It's trouble. It's 61 AD, and it's still at the end of winter. You still got problems coming along. And from there we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium. And a day later, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to I can never say this. Puteoli. You got to say it like you're an Italian, okay? Because we're in Italy. All right. Okay. So here we go. They come 3 days here. They come around to Rhegium. And what they're doing is probably getting rid of grain and cargo. And then a south wind begins to blow this way. And they say, let's go. And they go 182 miles up to this city here. That is finally the journey on water. They are through with the water. From there, they're going to travel 90 miles up to Rome. So let's pick up there. And the brethren, verse 15. And the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Appius and 3 inns to meet us. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. The market of Appius is 40 miles up the road. And it's a market. But it was a market that was full, just like a carnival atmosphere, of thieves and bandits and carnival type people. And so it was not a place. But people from Rome heard that Paul was coming, and they came down that 40 miles to meet him there. And some of the people did not meet him there. 10 miles north of that is the 3 inns, and some people met him there as they traveled on up by land into Rome. And when they get into Rome, if protocol is followed, then they are supposed to. Julius is supposed to deliver Paul to the captain of the Perigean is what it's called. Verse 16 says, "And when we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldiers who were guarding him." Okay. The peregrini. Got to get that word right. Or make it up. Make it sound like it's Italian. Let me tell you who it is. It's the captain of this. Anybody who is not a Roman citizen is considered a part of this group. They're second-class people. They're not really like the Romans. They don't have all the privileges. If you have had a death penalty put upon you, you now have lost your Roman citizenship, and you're part of this group. All the prisoners who were sent to Rome would go to this captain. The centurion would deliver them this captain, and this captain would take them over and put them in the Colosseum chambers so they could be part of the games that were going to happen there, to have them ripped apart by lions and tigers and bears, oh my, okay, and all of that. Now, our commentators tell us, the problem with that is Paul should have been part of that group, but he wasn't. Paul was allowed, by Luke's affirmation, to live in his own rented house for 2 years. That meant that Julius probably delivered Paul to Burrus. Burrus was the prefect of the Praetorian Guard. And he had the authority to do this. Probably, we don't know this for sure, but probably Julius gave Burrus this great personal testimony to how Paul was trustworthy. And so Burrus would be allowed to put him, say, Paul, you go rent your own house. I'm going to have a guard there to be with you. We're going to have you in chains, but you're going to be there on your own, and you're going to have to rent the place. Well, where's Paul going to get this money? Well, he's going to have donations given to him to that. In fact, Philip, the town of Philippi sends him a donation to help pay for this stuff, and it's very meager. And they're worried about that. But it's money to rent his own place. And so Paul is there. Well, Paul is there for 3 days in his own rented place. And Paul's thinking, what do we need to do here? I got to do something. I'm here. I'm just sitting in Rome waiting for my turn to see Nero. What can I do? I know what I'll do. I'll call a meeting of all the Jews in town. And if you remember back in 49 A.D., Claudius had got tired of all the Jews and said, all you Jews get out of town. That's what caused Priscilla and Aquila to leave the church in Rome that they'd started in their home and go over to Ephesus. And so by now, Claudius Caesar dies in 54 AD, and so the Jews are coming back in. So Paul decides, hey, I'm going to have a meeting of the Jews right here in my own rented house. And it happened that after 3 days, he called together those who were being the leading men of the Jews, and when they had come together, he began saying to them, and he just starts off by talking. He thinks they already know, but they don't know. Brethren, though I had done nothing against our people or the customs of our father, yet I was delivered prisoner from Jerusalem into the hands of the Romans. And when they had examined me, they were willing to release me because there was no ground for putting me to death. But when the Jews objected, I was forced to appeal to Caesar, not that I had any accusation against my nation. And for this reason, therefore, I requested to see you and to speak with you, for I am wearing this chain for the sake of the hope of Israel. He's talking to the Jews. Remember back on Corinth, he got so mad at him, he said, I'm never going to talk to the Jews again. And that night, Jesus came along, sent an angel, and said, hey, stood by his bed and said, look, you go on back, you talk to the Jews. You're supposed to talk to the Jews. And he does. Well, Paul hasn't given this up. He wants Israel to be saved. And they said to him, here's what they said, we've not heard neither a letter from Judea concerning you, nor have we heard any of the brethren come here and report or spoken anything bad about you. We don't know what you're talking about, Paul. Although, he says, but we desire to hear from you about what your views are, for concerning this sect, it is well known to us that it is spoken against everywhere. Well, it's because the people from over here on this country, from Macedonia and from Asia, this is Asia Minor over here, these people have gotten word over here. They're traveling the roads. The Jews are talking about this thing called the Way, and they don't speak good about it. So they've heard, so they pick a day, and they're going to have this day, and they're going to have this meeting together. And when they had set a day for him, they came to him at his lodging in the large numbers. They showed up at his rented house. And he was explaining to them by solemnly testifying about the kingdom of God and trying to persuade them about concerning Jesus from both the law of Moses and the prophets from morning until evening. This was a long meeting. All-day summit. We're having a meeting. Show up for breakfast and we'll stay until midnight. And Paul's talking about them, same thing he's done every single place. He talks about Moses. He talks about the prophets. He talks about what Moses taught. He talks about what the prophets taught. He says Jesus is what Moses talked about. Jesus is what the prophet talked about. Will you come to Jesus? And just like in every other single case, some accepted him and some didn't. Verse 23. And verse 24. And some were being persuaded by the things spoken, but others would not believe. And here we are at the end of the book, finally. And when they did not agree with one another, they began leaving after Paul had spoken one parting word. And it's only one sentence after he quotes from Isaiah. Isaiah used this passage back in Isaiah chapter 6, verse 9 through 10, to talk about the unbelief of the Jews. back in 650 A.D. And they hadn't learned their lesson. They didn't believe in the Lord back then. Even though they believed in Moses the prophet, they did not really believe because they didn't believe the message they had taught. So Jesus uses it when he explains his parables about the disbelief of the Jews. Then Jesus point blank uses it to talk about the disbelief of the Jews. And now Paul's using it to talk about the disbelief of the Jews. Go to this people and say, you will keep on hearing but will not understand, and you will keep on seeing but will not perceive. For the heart of this people has become dull, and with their ears they scarcely hear, and they have closed their eyes, lest they should see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their heart, and return, and I should heal them. Talking about the Lord. If the Lord said, I should heal them, but they won't. They've closed their ears, they've closed their eyes, they're not going to do it. And Paul adds his last line here. Let it be known to you, therefore, that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will also listen. He's going to go on back to the Gentiles with the message. For 2 years, Paul is in that room by himself. Verse 30. And he stayed for 2 years in his own rented quarters and was welcoming all who came to him, preaching the kingdom of God and teaching concerning the Lord Jesus Christ with all openness and unhindered. That ends the book of Acts. Luke evidently goes on in ministry because he does not tell us what happens during that 2-year period of time. I'm going to tell you what happens during that 2-year period of time. He is there and he has heard of the problems in the church. The first century church, I've said this to you before, I'm saying it to you again. You don't want to be part of a first century church. The stuff that went on in the first century church was horrible, folks. Now, we want to be part of the church that had the instruction that was given to the first century church that allows us to live in the freedom that we have. But these churches we're going through and haven't lived through. Over in Ephesus, Paul, when he left those Ephesian leaders in Miletus, 4 years before, he says to them, you're going to have problems because they're going to come after you. And he's heard they're coming after him. So he writes a letter to the church in Ephesus saying, here is how you thwart the darts of evil that are coming after you from those people, from those Asian Jews who are coming after you in Ephesus. So he writes to Ephesus to tell them that during this 2-year period of time. He writes to Philippi. Philippi in Thessalonica has sent him an offering. It's a little bitty offering. It's not very big because now this church is a poor church. They're having a hard time keeping their doors open. They're having a hard time staying in as a church whatsoever. And so the offering is so small. Epaphroditus has brought this offering to Paul to help pay his bills over in Rome. And Paul writes them back a letter saying, look, I know you're struggling. I know you're having a hard time, but take courage. Remember, there was a time when you took up a huge offering, which I took down through Corinth and then took it on over to the Jews, the Christian churches in Judea to help support them when they were having a hard time. In fact, most of you have a favorite verse out of the book of Philippians. And even though it was written to handle a problem in Philippi and a struggle in Philippi, he wrote it in such a way to bring great courage through those struggles. He writes also to the Colossians. Over in Colossae, they've got a big problem. The Judaizers, which we've talked about, have shown up. And they are trying to change the church back into the regulations of the Jewish way of life with the Mosaic law. We don't want that in our church. In fact, we've got a strain of that going on in Christianity right now called the Messianic Christians, who are just doing the exact same thing, trying to keep all those Jewish laws and hang on to it, and it is a mess. It is a real mess. But in Colossae, they've got more problems. The problem in Colossae, if they've got the mystic Orientals who are coming in with all the ancient Hindu-type beliefs. They're coming in and saying, hey, if you do this, you can have this higher spirituality and you can deal in the world of the spirits. That's in Colossae. We don't want that today. And he didn't want it back in that day. And Paul writes to the church in Colossae saying, here's how to handle that. Philemon is in Colossae. He's a member of the church in Colossae. And Paul has met there in Rome a prisoner by the name of Onesimus, who is a runaway slave. And he's been put in prison in Rome. Paul leads Onesimus to the Lord. And Paul sends Onesimus with the letter to Philemon, back to Philemon and his wife, and saying, hey, Onesimus has come to a faith in Christ. I'm sending him back to you because he belongs to you. But let me tell you something, Philemon. If you would see well, Onesimus is good for my ministry. If you can send him back to me, he'll do a whole lot of stuff for me with me here. And so he sends him that letter to handle that problem of a slave that is a runaway. Those 4 books are written during that 2-year time he's in prison. Finally, Paul is let out of prison after 2 years. He has stood before Nero, and there's no one there to uphold the charges against him, so Nero lets him go. That happens in 63, AD 63. Well, of course, you know what happens in AD 64. Rome burns, and Nero blames it on the Christians. Well, let's just back up just a little bit. Now, right here in between, Paul being let loose and Rome burning, Paul gets out, and Luke sits down and finally writes this letter to Theophilus about the Acts of the Apostles, where he is comparing Paul and Peter, and he brings up 2 other names. He brings up Stephen, the incident of Stephen being stoned introduces Paul to the world, and he brings up Philip, because Philip is the one who is going to end up back in Caesarea and is going to be part of that great prophecy stuff, talking about what's going to happen to Paul when he ends up back in Philippi. That's the reason why those 2 people are brought up. But the book of Acts, as you know, since we've gone through, is about Peter and Paul. That's who it's about. All right, going on. While out in 64 also, while Paul is out, somebody writes the book of Hebrews. Now, I think it's Paul. The reason why I think it's Paul is because a lot of people don't think it's Paul because it's not written with the same Greek emphasis. No, it's written in Hebrew. And Paul would have written it in Hebrew. But when you get to the last chapter of the book of Hebrews, where he calls for Timothy to come and bring his coat, and he needs Timothy to come to him, it's so much like Paul. And also, Paul is Timothy's father in the faith. And he has that right to call him to come. So I believe that Paul writes the book of Hebrews while he is out. We pick up then, after that, we pick up Peter in 65. In 65, Peter writes his 2 letters. Peter is over in Babylon on the Euphrates River, and which is way over here in what we would call Iraq. And he is writing the letters to the Jews of Asia Minor. Asia Minor, this area right here, that Paul has been ministering to in Ephesus. He's been there for 3 years. He's been ministering to them. And they don't believe it. They're the ones that caused problems with him in Jerusalem that caused him to get taken to Rome in the first place. These Asian Jews. And Peter writes his first letter to them. And then finally he writes a second letter to them too. And in that one he makes this incredible verbiage about how Paul has written them Scripture that is difficult to understand, but it is still Scripture and it is part of what God wants them to know. And so Peter is, in both letters, Peter is affirming to the Asian Jews, believers and not believers, that what Paul has taught them is absolutely correct. All right. While Paul is out, Paul writes his first letter to Timothy. Timothy, he is out. He's evidently come from Rome. He's evidently made it to Ephesus, and he's left Timothy in Ephesus, and he writes back to Ephesus and to Timothy to tell them how to structure the church and how the church is supposed to be organized. He also, at the same time, writes a letter to Titus, who is down here on the island of Crete. Not on the Fairhaven side, but on the other side. He writes a letter to them talking to him about, by the way, Paul had left him there to do this work, left Titus there to do the work on Crete. And there he lists the qualifications for the pastor, for the offices of the church, and what qualifications you have to be in those leadership positions. Well, the next thing that happens is Paul is taken back into imprisonment, taken back into custody in AD 67. AD 67, he goes back into jail. Nero is pulling all the Christians in. He's going to kill them. And Paul gets wrapped up in that. There in prison, he writes Timothy his second letter. And he says, Timothy, I want you to come to me. I need to see you. But with all this persecution going on, he says, come on and see me, but be encouraged, be steadfast, no matter what persecutions come to you. So Paul writes his second letter from Rome back to Timothy in Ephesus to tell Timothy to come back to him in Rome. Boy, that is a mess on that board, isn't it? Well, we don't know whether Timothy makes it back or not, but all we know is in 67 AD, 86-7, Paul stands before Nero again. And standing before Nero, Nero has him put to death. He is beheaded. The very next year, Jude writes his letter warning the church of all this people who are trying to come into the church to be part of the church, but they want to change it. They're actually there to shipwreck the church. 22 years later, John is the only apostle left. And John decides to write his gospel, which is where we're headed next week, by the way. We're headed to the book of John. And John's gospel, John fills in all the gaps. Because Matthew, Mark, and Luke only tells us about the Galilean ministry, but John tells us about the Judean ministry. And it's great because John is wonderful. He may only write one line about when they go north to Galilee and come back, but John tells us where it happens. And he does not repeat everything that Matthew, Mark, and Luke says about the Galilean ministry. So John tells us the Judean ministry, tells us when he goes to Galilee, but didn't tell us what happens up there, mainly because he's so young, he may not actually have been with them all the time. And then he picks up the passion, which is in all of them, of the death of Christ, and fills it on out. 5 years later, John writes his 3 little books, 1 John, 2 John, and 3 John, each with a purpose. 2 John is to handle the same thing Jude has just written about 22 years earlier. And finally, the following year, Domitian, Nero is already dead, and the Caesar Domitian gets John and puts him on the Isle of Patmos in exile, along with Polycarp and Clement of Alexandria. Some men that are going to be fine, huge first generation ministers after all the apostles are gone in the early 100s. In the world and being pastors of the greatest churches that are around that point in time. They're on this island of Patmos with him, and John has this vision of the Revelation. And of course, we've studied through that, and the rest of the Bible affirms everything that John says. The Bible is finished, the New Testament is finished. And by the way, through this book of Acts, if you look through your notes, it tells you in the book of Acts in your notes exactly where every single book of the New Testament belongs and where it was written and why it was written, and we are done. Next week we should go off to the book, the Gospel of John. That'll take us between 10 and 12 weeks. From there we'll go to Matthew. That'll take us to Christmas time, and we will be finished with the entire commentary, and you have notes and been through the entire New Testament at that point in time. That is our goal, and I want every one of you to live that long. You got that? Lord Jesus, thank you for allowing Luke to give us this wonderful narrative that tells us what happened to Paul, that ties everything together so that even from Paul's letters we can pull together how everything happened so that we can understand the struggles and the persecutions that happened in that first century church. That they gave their life and their blood so that we can live in Christianity with the instruction that we need from you. Thanks for delivering it, Lord, and may we live by it. In your Son's name, amen.